I've worked storm restoration for 11 years. Power lines. I've climbed poles in ice storms at 2 in the morning, ridden out a tornado watch in a bucket truck because the dispatcher said the cell was tracking north and it didn't. Slept in the bed of my pickup at the bottom of hollows where the sun doesn't touch the ground till 10 in the morning. I'm telling you all that so you understand the kind of man I am. I'm not jumpy. I don't tell stories. I grew up in the woods of West Virginia, and I've been alone in them more nights than I could count. What happened on that ridge in the Monongahela is the one thing in my life I've never been able to set down. And I've tried. It was the second week of September. I had 4 days off, which doesn't happen much in my line of work, and I drove up alone to scout a spot for hunting season. A long backcountry ridge off Forest Road 14, the kind of place where you don't pass another truck the whole drive in. I left the truck where the road quit and hiked maybe 2 miles up to a flat bench just under the crest. A good spot, water in the draw below me, clear sight lines down both slopes. I set my tent, gathered wood, cooked a can of chili on my little stove, and sat by the fire until it burned down to coals. I want you to picture how ordinary it was. I was happy. I texted my wife from the one bar I had on the climb up, and then lost signal and didn't think about it again. I whistle, always have. My dad did it the whole time he worked, and I picked it up off him without meaning to. It's a thing my mouth does when my head's somewhere else, the way some men hum. So the next morning, breaking down my breakfast and packing my day bag, I whistled. That little up-down thing you do without thinking about it. Something whistled it back. Up, then down, same as mine, from down the north slope, a couple 100 yards off through the timber. My first thought wasn't even a thought, it was just, bird. There's a few species that'll throw your own sound right back at you if you give them a clean enough note. So I whistled again, the same 2 notes, to see. And it came back again, same 2 notes, from the same place. So I gave it a harder one, 3 notes this time, a dumb little climbing tune with no meaning to it. It came back. The same dumb little climbing tune. I'll be straight with you. At that point, I figured it was a person. Another fella up there scouting, having a little fun with me the way you do when you hear somebody else moving around. So I cupped my hands and called out, and nothing answered. No whistle, no holler back, no hey of its own. I stood there a while with my coffee going cold, and I decided it was some guy who didn't feel like a conversation, which happens out there. Men go to the woods to not talk, and I let it be and went back to my packing. Here's the part I keep coming back to, the part I wish I'd left alone. I tested it. I don't really know why, except that I work with my hands, and when a thing in front of me doesn't add up, I poke at it until it does. I picked up my steel cook pot, and I struck it twice against the rock I was sitting on. 2 flat clangs, metal on stone. Not a sound any bird or any throat makes. Nothing that lives in those woods makes that exact sound. I waited. A few seconds went by, and then, from down the slope, in the same spot as before, 2 whistles. The same count as my 2 clangs. I should have walked away right then. Instead, I stood there in the gray morning light, and I ran an experiment. Because that's what you do when you can't believe a thing. You try to break it. 3 knocks on a deadfall log. It gave back 3 whistles. A long whistle and 2 short. It gave back a long and 2 short. A rhythm. 5 quick raps. 5 quick whistles. And every single time there was that gap first. Those few seconds, like whatever it was, needed a moment to work out what I'd just done before it could answer me. My mouth had gone dry as paper, and I'd started talking to myself out loud, narrating it the way you do to keep yourself level on a job that's gone sideways. Okay, that's a person. That's just a guy. That has to be a person. Except a person answers when you yell at him, and a person gets bored of a game and quits. This didn't quit. It answered everything, patiently, in order, like it was glad I'd finally found something it could do with me. I packed up and got out of there. I'm not going to pretend it was calm or that I did it smart. I left my cook pot sitting on the rock, and I lost a tent stake I never found because I was not about to get down on my knees and dig in the dirt for it. I had my phone out for the GPS track to get me back down to the truck, and at some point on the way down, I genuinely don't remember deciding to do it. I'd started a voice memo. I record myself on jobs sometimes, talk through a panel I want to remember the wiring of. I think my thumb just did it on its own, out of habit while the rest of me was somewhere else. I made the road in under 30 minutes, half jogging where the grade let me, and the whistling came down off the ridge with me. Off the slope to my right, back in the trees, the whole first half of the way out. Same distance the whole time, never far enough to lose. I'd whistle nothing, keep my mouth shut tight, and it would whistle anyway. Little patterns now, like it didn't need me to start them anymore. And then, somewhere around the halfway point, it just wasn't there. The ordinary sound of the morning woods came back all at once, birds and wind and my own boots on the rock, and I realized I'd been hearing nothing but those two things, my boots and that whistle, for 20 straight minutes, and the birds had been quiet the whole time and I hadn't noticed them stop. I got to the truck and I drove out, and I did not think about that recording for 3 weeks. I didn't want to. I knew it was on my phone and I let it sit there. When I finally made myself play it, late one night with my wife asleep, it was mostly just me. Boots on gravel, hard breathing, the robot GPS voice telling me to continue on the route. You can hear my whistle on it, and then a few seconds later you can hear the answer come up faint from down the slope, exactly the way I remembered it. It made my skin go cold just hearing it again, but there was nothing on it I hadn't lived, so I played it for my brother. He runs sound for bands, he's got the ears and the software for it, and I told him it was a weird echo I'd caught and I wanted to know what made it. He took the file and ran it through whatever he runs things through to pull the noise floor up and clean a recording. And a couple days later he called me, and he was quiet on the phone in a way that he just is not. My brother is never quiet. He said the far-off whistle, the answer coming up off the slope, it was on there, plain as day, just like I'd said. But he said there was something else under it that I never would have heard out in the open air, because it was too quiet and too close to the mic for the open ridge to carry it to my ears. He said in the half second right before each answer came up off the slope, there was a small sound, right up against the phone, an inch from it. He played it for me, isolated and brought up loud, and I knew it the second I heard it because everybody knows it. It's the sound a person makes drawing breath in through their lips, the little catch you make right before you whistle. The answer was coming from 200 yards down the ridge. The breath was coming from right next to me. I was 24, and it was my second season with the Forest Service, when one of the district guys asked if I'd be willing to spend a few weeks alone up at one of the old fire lookouts. It hadn't been a real staffed posting since the 80s, when the spotter planes and the cameras took over, but the agency kept the cabin maintained for emergency relief, and during a bad dry stretch, they wanted somebody up there to do repairs and be a set of human eyes on the country. A little 14 by 14 glass box up on steel legs, 40 feet of stairs to climb, on the bald top of a peak in Montana, with 360 degrees of nothing around it, but ridgelines folding away into more ridgelines. I thought it was the best assignment a guy my age could possibly draw, and for most of it, it was. The cabin still had all the original equipment in it. The Osborne Firefinder on its stand in the middle of the room, the old laminated maps that had gone yellow at the folds, and a cloth-bound logbook where the lookouts going back decades had recorded their watches. Weather, smokes, and where they were, lightning counts, and in between all of that the small human notes of somebody who spends months alone on a mountain. What they cooked, a hawk that came by, how the loneliness was sitting that week. I read the whole thing the first night by lantern light, and it took me about 4 hours. The ones that stayed with me were from the early 60s. 6 straight seasons of them, all in the same patient old hand. That careful, long-tailed cursive nobody under 60 writes anymore. The kind they taught with a nib pen. Every one of them signed off at the bottom with the same 2 initials. RH. Whoever he was, he'd been up on that mountain longer than any other lookout in the book. It felt right to keep my own notes in the back of it, like I was continuing something instead of just squatting in a dead man's chair. So I started an entry each evening at sunset before I climbed down, because I did climb down every night. Sleeping up in a glass box that creaks and sways in the wind takes some getting used to, and I hadn't gotten used to it yet. So I'd pitched a 2-man tent in the cleared flat at the base of the tower, and I'd go down the 40 feet of stairs at last light, cook my supper on a little stove, and get in the bag. The stairs on that tower were steel, open riser, welded plate, bolted straight into the frame. A boot on them made a hollow ring you could hear from a mile off if the wind was right. I know that because I spent the better part of 2 days wire brushing and painting them. The 4th night I stayed up in the box past sundown, later than usual, finishing my entry by headlamp. The wind had gone dead, not slack, dead. The tower wasn't creaking or swaying or doing any of the settling noises I'd been getting used to. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a step on the stairs. One metallic clang, the weight of a full-grown man in boots coming down onto the bottom tread. Then a pause of maybe 3 seconds, and another one tread up, then another. I stood there in the middle of the cabin with my pencil still in my hand and listened to somebody climb up toward me. I counted, because there were 38 risers on that flight, and I knew the number cold. The steps came up to about 18 or 20, and then they stopped. I waited a long while and nothing else came. So I went to the trapdoor, it opened down onto the landing, and I lifted it and put my headlamp down the stairwell. The stairs were empty, all the way down to the ground, empty. My tent sitting pale in the moonlight at the bottom, my little unlit stove beside it, and nothing else anywhere for 9 miles in any direction. My first thought was, a tower 40 feet up in the air cools uneven, one leg going faster than another, and the whole structure ticks and clangs as the metal shrinks. That is a real thing that happens, and I've worked around enough metal to know it. 5th night, same thing. Same ring starting at the bottom, and it came up 24 steps before it quit. 6th night, 29, so I stopped staying up past sunset. I'd get down and into the tent before the light went, telling myself the sounds needed the tower quiet and unstirred to happen, and that if I was down at the base with the stove going and moving around, the structure would be in enough natural creak and hum that whatever it was wouldn't do the trick. 7th night I was down before dark, ate, cleaned up, got in the bag by full dark. The wind had come back up in the evening the way it usually did, and I heard boots on gravel around my tent. Somebody walking at the pace of a man doing a patrol. A full circle around the tent at a radius of maybe 8 feet. I could hear the individual grind of gravel under each footfall walking around me. I didn't move, and I didn't breathe out loud, and I listened to the whole lap. Then the boots crossed back over to the base of the tower and went up the metal stairs, one ring at a time, to the top. I understood that night, lying in the bag sweating in 40-degree air, that it had followed me down. After that, it happened every night. Up in the box, past dark, the stairs. Down in the tent, the circle. Some nights both, a lap around the tent and then up the stairs, and once back down and around again, like it had lost track of me and had to check. I did some stupid things in there. I slept with a hatchet, which is about the least useful object I could have picked. I left the stove burning one night for the light and nearly cooked myself. I tried running a little wind-up radio on low so I'd have something else to listen to, and I could still hear the boots under the music. I also kept doing the work. That's the part people don't believe. I rehung a shutter, I regraded the drainage on the north side, and I ate my meals. You'd think a thing like this would stop your life. Mostly it just gets folded into it. One night the boots stopped, right outside the tent door. I've thought about this part more than all the rest of it put together, and I'll try to get it right. It was close to a minute and a half. Somebody standing 6 inches from my head, with one layer of coated nylon between us. And then the wall of the tent came in, an inch maybe. a shallow dimple pressing inward in the nylon about 4 inches from my face, and it stayed there, like it already knew where my head was and had come down to put its hand next to it. I didn't move. I have never in my life not moved the way I did, not moved for that minute and a half, and I kept my eyes open on that dimple in the dark because closing them was worse. Then there was a sound I've never been able to explain to anybody in a way that lands. I don't know what to call it. It definitely wasn't a voice. Closest I can get is the sound a man makes low in his throat when he finds a thing he's been looking for and doesn't want to say anything out loud about it yet. The dimple went out of the nylon, and the boots moved on and finished the circle and went back to the stairs. That was the worst night I had up there. It never touched me. It came down to where my face was and put its hand there and made that sound, and then it went back to work, and whatever it had come to check it had found, and finding it hadn't required coming through the door. The day I drove down to the trailhead for a resupply run, I tracked down the old district hand, a guy who'd worked that country since the 70s, and I asked him who used to man that lookout in the old days. He leaned on his truck and thought about it and rattled off a few names. Then he said the one everybody in the district still talked about was a fellow who'd manned that exact tower alone for 6 straight seasons back in the early 60s, and who went off the catwalk one night in a bad storm. They never did settle whether he fell or walked off on purpose. Didn't find him until the snow went off in the spring, way down the talus on the north face. He said the man had loved that lookout more than was healthy for a person, that he never wanted to come down at the end of a season, that they practically had to order him off the mountain every fall. Never really did come down, you ask some of the old-timers, he said, and laughed a little, the way you laugh at a thing that isn't funny. I asked him what a lookout used to do at night, all alone up there. He looked at me like it was an odd question. He said there's nothing to do at night, that it's the whole point of the job. You watch in daylight and you sleep in the dark because you can't see smoke in the dark anyway. Nobody's walking rounds up there, he said. Wouldn't be a thing to walk rounds. I asked him if anybody had ever reported hearing anything at that tower. He told me the agency doesn't send people up there alone anymore, and that somebody was supposed to have told me that before I went, and that somebody had dropped the ball. He wouldn't say who. When I pushed, he told me the tower had been on the removal list for years, and every year the money for it went somewhere else. I asked him the man's name. He told me. The initials were RH. Then he asked me how many steps it had come up. I hadn't said anything to him about the stairs. After that, I finished out my weeks. Well, I took the job, and I'm not somebody who quits a thing partway. I'd like to tell you I made peace with it, that I got the shape of it worked out and got comfortable, but that isn't what happened. I never worked out anything. I quit trying to. I did the repairs and watched the country in daylight, and at night I lay in a bag and listened to something walk around me, and after a while I could sleep through most of it. That's not the same as it stopping. You just get worse at caring. The last night I sat up with my heart going and unzipped the door. There was nothing out there. No prints. There were never any prints. There was never anything but the sound. I hiked out that morning with my pack and I didn't go back up to the box for my last log entry. It's the only part of that job I ever left unfinished, and I never told the district. The truck was an hour down the trail and I made it in 40 minutes. I've told myself for 22 years that some things don't come down off the mountain, that they're fixed to a place, and the place keeps them, and once you're off it, you're off it. I've told myself that on a lot of nights. "12 years. After almost 12 years running trail crews, I have slept in more bad spots in the backcountry than any sane person ever should. In the rain, in the wind, on a slope so steep I had to tie myself off, on bare rock, with a bear working the edge of the firelight all night. You learn fast in this work to take a dry, safe spot the second one is offered, because they are rare, and your body needs the real rest to do the labor the next day. That instinct, grab the good spot, is bred down into the bone of anybody who lives and works outside. It is the most basic survival sense there is. And it is exactly why what we found up in the Shoshone in Wyoming has stayed with me the way it has. Because every one of us ignored that instinct, talked ourselves right past it, and it was only later, in the morning, that we understood why we never should have. There were 4 of us doing trail reconstruction work back in a remote drainage. A good week's hike out from the nearest trailhead, resetting tread and clearing blowdown on a stretch that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Late one afternoon, a storm came up over the divide fast, the way they do up high, a cold, hard mountain rain with the temperature dropping behind it. The kind of rain that will put hypothermia on you in July if you let it soak you through and the wind get at you. We needed shelter, and we needed it quick, and we found it. A 3-sided log shelter, old and hand-built, tucked back tight against a rock face so the overhang of the cliff kept the weather off the open side. The kind of thing a trapper or an old outfitter might have thrown up 100 years back. It was, honestly, the finest backcountry shelter any of the 4 of us had ever come across in all our years. Dry, safe, protected, roomy. After a week of sleeping on the wet ground, it looked like a hotel with the light on. But there were signs around it that didn't sit right, and it was Reyes, who's been at this work even longer than I have, who started pointing them out while we stood there in the first of the rain. All around the shelter, out in the open, out in the bad spots where the wind came across and the rain came sideways, there was evidence that a great many people had camped over the years. Old fire rings out in the exposed open. Flattened, rectangular tent spots worn into the ground out where there was no protection at all. Tarp tie-offs cut and weathered on the trees out at the edges of the clearing, out where you'd catch the full weather. Years of it, decades of it maybe. Person after person after person who had come to this exact place with a perfect dry shelter standing right there in front of them, and had chosen, every one of them, to set up out in the open instead. Out in the wind, out in the rain, anywhere but inside. Reyes said it first, out loud, what we were all looking at. He said, "Why does nobody ever sleep in the shelter? Everybody camps around it, in the worst spots they could find." We stood there in the rain and we talked about it, the way you do, throwing out the reasonable answers. Maybe the shelter got built later than the camps. Maybe people thought it was somebody's private property and didn't want to trespass. Maybe it had pack rats in it, or a porcupine, or a bad smell. But none of it held up, and we could see it didn't, because the shelter was plainly the oldest thing in that clearing by a long way. Older than any of the fire rings, and it was clean and dry and sound and good, and we were 4 cold, wet people with a real storm coming down on us, and the knowledge, bred into all of us, that exposure is the thing that actually kills you out here. So we did the sensible thing, the thing our training and our good sense and our cold bodies all told us to do. We went inside, and the night was fine. That is the part I have to make you understand. Nothing came, nothing touched us. We built a small fire at the open side. We ate our dinners, we strung a line and hung our wet things, and we slept, dry and warm, while the storm hammered down on the roof and lashed the clearing outside. And I remember, I am ashamed to say, actually feeling a little smug about it as I drifted off. All those people over all those years, sleeping out in the weather like fools when there was a perfectly good roof right here that anyone with sense would take. It was in the morning, packing up, that one of the crew, a young guy named Dell, was rolling his sleeping pad back in the far corner of the shelter, and he stopped, and he said, "Hey." The dirt floor back in that corner was soft, and the toe of his boot had scuffed up something pale out of it. He crouched down and brushed at it with his fingers, and then he stood up real fast and took a step back and didn't say anything else. It was a button, a small bone button, old and yellowed. And the moment we'd all seen the one, we couldn't stop seeing the floor for what it was. The whole dirt floor of that shelter, under the soft scuffed top layer of it, was full of things. We did not dig, I want to be clear about that. We are not the kind of people who dig, and I would not have let them. But just in what Dell's boot had turned up, and in what you could see pressed and half sunk into the surface of the floor once you knew to look down and look close, there were buttons, a corroded belt buckle, The hard-curled shape of a leather boot sole gone stiff as wood, a folding pocket knife, the bone handle of it, a little glass bottle, a comb, the small, ordinary personal things that a person carries in their pockets and their pack. Layers of them, many people's worth of them, worked down into the packed dirt floor of that dry, safe, comfortable shelter over a very long stretch of years. And I understood, standing there, why nobody sleeps inside. The people who slept outside, out in the wind and the rain, in the worst exposed spots they could find, year after year after year, they were not fools. They were the ones who had figured it out. They would rather take the storm than take the roof. Because everybody who took the roof, everybody who did the sensible thing, the smart thing, the thing the four of us had done the night before without a second real thought, they are the floor. They went inside to get out of the weather, and they never came back out. And the next cold, exhausted, sensible traveler who came along set up out in the rain instead, having seen, somehow, in some sign or some feeling, the thing the rest of us were too cold and too smart and too sure of ourselves to see. We slept in there a whole night, the four of us. We slept the entire night, warm and dry and pleased with our own good sense, lying on top of all of them. And for whatever reason, I will never know and do not want to, that one night it let us get up in the morning and walk back out. I guide backcountry ski trips for a living, and part of the winter I run trips out of a remote hut up in the mountains in Utah, the kind of place you have to skin into, hours from the trailhead on climbing skins. No road, no power, just a wood stove and a row of bunks and whoever's tough enough and dumb enough to come. I have spent a lot of winter nights in huts like that with the wind screaming around the eaves and felt nothing but cozy and safe, exactly where I want to be in the whole world. I love those places. That is precisely why the night at that one particular hut got into me the way it did, and stayed, because it took the one kind of place where I have always felt safest in the mountains, and it showed me what stands at the door of it in the dark. It was late in the season, just me and my partner Greg up there, doing some route checking and digging snow pits before a group came in later that week, so the hut was just the two of us. These huts keep a logbook, a journal where guests write entries, weather, route conditions, snowpack notes, the usual, and people leave little messages and warnings for the next group coming in. And I read it my first night, because the entries are part of the charm of a hut like that. Years and years of skiers and their best days, their epics and their close calls. Except, scattered all through the normal entries, going back years, in all different handwriting, written by all different people, there were other entries, and they all said a version of the very same thing. They warned about the door. They warned that on some nights there is a knocking at the door, and a voice, and that the voice will sound like someone you know, someone who should be inside with you, someone calling to be let in, saying they're cold, saying they're locked out. And every one of those entries ended the same way. Some of them underlined, some of them in a shaky hand. Do not open the door. No matter whose voice it is, no matter what it says, do not open the door. I showed Greg. We had a good nervous laugh about it, the two of us deciding it was a long-running hut joke. Generations of skiers adding to the legend to spook the next ones. So we cooked our dinner and turned in. The wind was up. The wind is always up at those huts. I woke sometime in the dead of night to knocking. A slow knocking at the hut door. And then a voice, Greg's voice, calling my name from outside, low, tired and shaking with cold. Saying he'd stepped out to check the weather and the door had latched behind him and he was freezing out there. Asking me to please come let him in. I lay in my bunk and I could hear Greg's voice clear as anything through that door, pleading, cold, saying my name, saying the small particular things only Greg would say. Our inside jokes, the shorthand you build up with somebody you spend a lot of cold days with. I rolled over and looked across the dark hut toward his bunk, and Greg was in it, asleep, down deep, breathing slow, 6 feet from me, while his voice, his exact voice, every catch and tone of it, stood outside the door in the wind and begged me to get up and come let it in. I did not open the door. I have never in my life been so grateful for anything as I am that I happened to read that logbook my very first night, because without it, I would have gotten up, half asleep, to let my freezing partner in out of the cold. The voice kept on a long time. It used everything. It got upset, then it got gentle and reasonable again. It used the small private name only my own family uses for me. And eventually, near dawn, it stopped, and there was only the wind and Greg, still asleep, who never woke through any of it. In the morning, I didn't say anything at first. I just watched him make the coffee. My partner, ordinary himself, grumbling about the cold the way he always does. And then I told him. All of it. He listened. He got a look on his face, and I thought he was about to tell me I'd dreamed it. But that is not what he said. He went pale. Then he set down his cup, and he asked me, what exactly did it say? I told him. I got to the name it had used near the end, the private name, the thing it had called me through the door in his voice. And Greg went still, because that is a name my partner uses for me. A private thing, just between the two of us, something he has never once said in front of another living soul, that there is no way on this earth that anyone or anything standing outside that door could possibly have known. It didn't just sound like him. It knew what he knows. It had been listening to the two of us, close enough and long enough to learn the private things. And it stood outside the door of that hut in his voice and used them, one by one, to try to get me to slide the bolt and open it. We skinned out that same morning, and I moved the group's trip to a different hut, and I have never gone back to that one, and I never will. Because something up there in the mountains knows the most private name I have, learned it off me in the dark, and it is still standing out there in the wind on the cold nights, patient, working through whose voice to use, waiting for a night when whoever's inside hasn't read the logbook yet. I ran a road grader for the county for 34 years before I retired. I have spent the better part of my life on the back roads of the Ozarks, the gravel, the dirt, and the old logging cuts that don't go anywhere anymore, the section roads, the spurs that dead end at a field nobody's planted in 40 years. I know roads the way a man knows the lines in his own hand. I can tell you which ones the county keeps, which ones go back to a single house, which ones the state forgot about, which ones just quit. So when I tell you I found a road in the Ozark National Forest in Arkansas that I cannot account for, a road that has never shown up on a single map I have looked at since, in 2 years of looking, you can take that from a man who has made a living knowing the difference. It was March, mushroom season coming on, the morels just starting in the creek bottoms, and I'd driven my truck back into the forest on a Forest Service road to scout for them. I parked where the road got too rough for the truck and I walked, the way I've done 100 times, watching the ground, the south-facing slopes where the morels come first. And maybe a mile in, crossing a low ridge, I came down the far side of it and walked out onto a road. It shouldn't have been there. That was my first thought, and it never went away. It ran off through the timber at an angle to everything around it. An old roadbed, but a real one, graded once and graded well. You could read the cut of it, the way the ground had been worked flat and crowned in the middle so the water would shed. That's my whole life's work, and I know it when I see it. Old work, but good work. Better than you'd expect for that far back in the trees. No ruts, no washboard, packed hard and grassed over but holding its shape clean. And the thing a roadman can't get past, the thing that stood the hair up on my arms before anything else happened, was that there was no reason for it. It didn't run from anywhere to anywhere. It came out of the timber on my left and it went into the timber on my right, and there was no homestead, no field, no quarry, no reason, and no map I have ever seen, before that day or since, shows a graded road anywhere in that part of the forest at all. So I followed it, I figured it would take me to something, an old homestead site, a family cemetery, one of the CCC camps from the 30s, something that would explain it. I walked it the better part of an hour, and the whole time it held graded and clean under my boots, and the woods on both sides of it got older as I went. Bigger trees, the kind of timber you don't see much in those hills anymore because they logged it all off a century back, but here it stood. Big old trunks, the canopy closing up high, the light going green and dim, and then the road opened out into a clearing, and in the clearing there were chairs. I want to be plain about this part, because it's the part that doesn't sound right when you say it out loud. It was a round clearing, packed bare dirt, no grass in it, and set out across it were chairs, wooden ones. Dozens of them, the wood gone soft and silver with age, straight-backed wooden chairs, the kind my grandmother kept in her front room. And they were set out in rows, curved rows, stepped a little, like a little amphitheater, like the seating at a tent revival. And every one of them was facing the same way, facing across the clearing toward the far side, where there wasn't a single thing, just the wall of trees. My first thought, and I held on to it as long as I could, was a church, a brush arbor meeting ground, an old outdoor revival site. That's a real thing back in those hills. Folks would gather out in a clearing in the summer, and a preacher would stand up at the front, and the people would sit on benches and chairs they brought, and there'd be singing, and it would go on for days. So I told myself that's what this was, some forgotten camp meeting ground, and I walked out among the chairs looking for the front of it, the stump or the platform or the rise where the preacher would have stood, the thing all those chairs were aimed at. There wasn't one. I walked all the way to the front row, turned and looked where every chair was pointed, and there was nothing there. No stand, no stage, no stump, no rise in the ground, no cross, nothing. Just the tree line, the same as all the way around. I stood there a good while turning it over, trying to make it make sense. And then I turned around to look back the way I'd come, back across all those rows of empty gray chairs toward the spot where the old road came out of the trees into the clearing, and I understood what they were facing, and it put a cold weight low in my belly that I have carried ever since. They weren't aimed at the front of the clearing. I'd had it backwards. They were aimed at the back, the one spot where a person would step out into the open. Every single one of those chairs was turned to face the place where someone arrives. It wasn't a congregation waiting on a preacher. It was an audience, and it was pointed at the door. I made myself walk over and look at the chairs up close, because I needed an ordinary thing to do with my hands and my eyes, something to push the rest of it back down. And the chair at the very front, the one with the cleanest line of sight to where a man comes out of the trees, was different from all the others. The gray wood of the seat was worn, smooth and shined the way a chair seat gets after years and years of somebody sitting in it day after day, the wood burnished by use. The rest of those chairs had moss grown into the joints and leaf litter caught in them, and the look of furniture that hadn't been touched in 50 years. That front one was clean. The seat was worn smooth, and when I put my hand flat down on it, the way you'd test a thing without thinking, it was warm. A wooden chair in a cold March clearing, no sun on it through that canopy, and the seat was warm. Warm the way a chair is warm when a body has just got up out of it. I walked back down that road a good deal faster than I'd come up it, and I did not look behind me one time. I got in my truck and I drove out of the forest. I've gone back into that country 3 times since, on purpose, with a GPS unit and a compass. It is not on the Forest Service map. It is not on the topographic map. The fellow at the district office, who's been there 20 years, had never heard of any meeting ground out that way and looked at me a little funny for asking. I've made my peace with most of it, the road that isn't there, the chairs, all of it. The one thing I have not made my peace with is that front chair. Worn smooth from years of sitting and warm under my hand. Somebody sits in that chair. Somebody sits in the best seat in the house, down front, facing the trees, and watches whatever the forest brings into that clearing. And the day I walked out of those trees, the seat was empty, and it was still warm, which means I got there just after they'd stood up out of it. I'm an archaeologist, and a lot of the work is survey, walking remote country on foot, looking for sites on long backcountry trips, often just me and one other person for days at a stretch. This was a survey trip in the New Mexico backcountry, high desert canyon country. Just me and a field partner named Thomas, several days out, mapping and recording. I tell people that my job makes me a good observer, that I'm trained to notice and record the small details most people walk right past. And that's true. It's the whole skill of the work, which is exactly why what I failed to notice on that trip for 3 whole days is the thing about it that I genuinely cannot get past. We were 2 days in when the man joined us. He came into our camp the second evening, on foot, out of the dusk. A friendly solo hiker. Said he was out doing more or less the same kind of thing we were, just walking the country, looking at it. And that's not unheard of out there. You do occasionally run into a solo person way back in the empty parts, somebody who came out to be alone with the land. He was good company, a real talker, and he knew the country well, knew his plants and his rocks and the history of the place better than I did in places, and he was helpful around camp. So he just fell in with us. And because the direction he was headed was the direction we were headed, he stayed and traveled with us. 3 days, sharing our fire every night, walking alongside us every day. Thomas and I both genuinely liked him. In country that empty and that silent, a third person whose good company is a real gift, and we were glad to have him. We parted ways at the trailhead at the end of it. He shook both our hands, thanked us for the company, said maybe we'd cross paths again out there sometime, and walked off across the lot, and Thomas and I loaded up and drove home. It had been a good trip, a good productive survey, and I did not think there was a single thing wrong with it. It was weeks later, putting together my photographs and field notes from the survey for the report, that the first thing surfaced. I had hundreds of photos. Site shots, landscape shots, the fire going, your partner cooking, the canyon in the morning light. And he was not in any of them. Not one. 3 days traveling together, sharing every single camp. And in all the dozens of camp photos with Thomas in them, the man was simply never there. I'd think, surely this one, the shot of the 3 of us around the fire the second night, and it would be just Thomas, alone, on the far side of the flames. I told myself he was camera shy, that he must have always happened to step out of frame, and I very nearly let it go at that. But once I had noticed that one thing, the rest of it came, one piece at a time, the way you reassemble something you didn't know you had recorded until you go looking. He never ate with us. 3 days, all those meals, and I could not bring up a single memory of him eating. He would sit with us at dinner and talk, and he never had any food. And when I'd offered that first night, he'd waved it off easy, said he'd already eaten, and I had never thought about it again until I was suddenly thinking about everything again at once. He never left a track. I am an archaeologist. I read ground for a living, and our camps were in sand and soft canyon soil, the kind that takes a print perfectly, and there were always, every morning, exactly 2 sets of fresh prints around our camp. I noticed it at the time, but not enough to actually pay attention. And the mornings out there were cold, that bone-dry, high desert cold, where every breath you take fogs white in the air in front of your face. And we'd sit there at the fire in the dark before sunup, Thomas and me, our breaths smoking out of us in the cold, talking with a man whose breath never once showed. 3 freezing mornings, his breath never fogged, not one time. I called Thomas. I was careful not to lead him. I just asked him, casually, what he remembered about the guy who'd traveled with us those few days. And there was a long pause on the line, a long one. And then he said, "You noticed it too." And the 2 of us went through it together on the phone, piece by piece. The photos, the food, the tracks, the breath and the cold. And it turned out each of us had separately filed away a piece of it as nothing at the time. And neither of us had said one word about any of it on the trip. And both of us had liked him, and both of us had walked 3 days through that empty, silent country with him at our side, and felt nothing but glad of the company the whole time. We never did figure out what he was. We only worked out, weeks too late, 100 miles away, safe in our ordinary lives with the lights on, every single sign that he had never been a man at all. Sitting there at our fire those 3 cold nights, breathing nothing into the freezing air, walking that country beside us by day and leaving it behind exactly as untouched, every morning, as if no one had walked it but the 2 of us. My friend Steph and I did a 4-day canoe trip on a river up in the North Woods, the upper Midwest. It's a one-way route where you put in at one access point and take out 40-some river miles downstream, and a shuttle service moves your car from the put-in to the takeout while you're on the water, downstream the entire way. Remote country, no road within miles of the water for most of the route, no cell signal once you're past the first bend. We'd both done trips like it before. We knew what we were doing on moving water, and we knew how to read a map. It was late morning on the second day when Steph, who was up in the bow, said, without turning around, "There's somebody on the bank." I looked where she meant. The far bank, river left, the opposite side from the one we'd been favoring. Thick black spruce came right down to the edge of the water over there. There was no beach or gravel bar and no trail, just a wall of forest meeting the river. And back in among the trunks set back in the trees, there was something pale, moving, keeping level with us. We were drifting at maybe a walking pace, and it was matching that exactly, sliding along through the trees on the far side at the same speed as the canoe. We called it a moose first. That's the reasonable thing. There are moose up there. Then when it kept on and didn't resolve into a moose, we called it a person, a hunter maybe, somebody fishing the far bank. And then, when it just kept going, mile after mile after mile, never once stepping clear of the tree line into the open, never falling behind us, never speeding ahead, always exactly level with the bow of the canoe, we stopped calling it things. Because none of the things fit. A moose does not pace a canoe at a steady walk for an hour. It spooks, it stops to feed, it crashes off. And a person cannot move through that kind of dense Northwoods blowdown. All those downed trunks and root wads and tangled spruce at a smooth, even walking pace, for an hour, for miles, without once stumbling out into the open or getting hung up or having to climb over something. And that far bank, we could both see plainly, had no trail on it. None. It was an unbroken wall of standing timber and deadfall that no person could move through quickly or quietly, for miles on end, and yet there it was, level with us, a pale shape sliding between the trunks every single time either of us turned to look. It stayed with us the rest of that day. We made camp at dusk on our own side, river right, on a little gravel point, and across the water, the last thing visible before the dark came down, it was standing at the very edge of the trees on the far bank, still exactly level with our camp, just inside the tree line, a pale upright shape. In the gray of the next morning, before we'd even loaded the canoe, it was there again, in the same spot across the water. And the whole second full day on the river, it paced us again. The far bank, never closer, never gone, hour after hour. By the afternoon of that second day, I needed it to be nothing so badly that I talked Steph into proving it was nothing. We came to a wide, slow stretch where the current was gentle enough to ferry across safely, and we paddled hard for the far bank, the one it was on. We ran the bow up onto the only break in the trees we could find. We got out and stood there with our hearts going, fully ready to laugh at ourselves, to find a deer trail, a set of boot prints, a moose wallow, anything ordinary that would let us get back in the boat and feel stupid and relieved. There was a track through the brush, a matted down line running through the blowdown, the spruce, the low vegetation crushed and broken and pressed flat, running along just inside the tree line, parallel to the water. It ran in both directions, upstream and down, as far along that bank as either of us could see. And it didn't have the look of a path that something had made that morning, walking it once. It had the deep, worn-in, pressed-down look of a trail that had been used over and over again for a long time. We followed it upstream a little way, just a little, neither of us wanting to go far, and it kept going, the entire length of river we had paddled the day before. 2 days of river, a single continuous worn path running along the far bank for exactly as far as we had come. A bank with no access, walled in by the river on the one side and miles of impassable blowdown forest on the other, in both directions, farther than either of us was willing to walk to find out. Nothing could have gotten onto that bank to wear a 2-day-long path along it. Nothing could have gotten off of it, and the path was there, packed smooth, running level with the water. We got back in the canoe and we paddled the last day and a half hard, harder than we needed to, and we did not make camp again. We ran it into the dark and slept in shifts sitting up against a deadfall near the takeout with the canoe pulled up beside us. The takeout was right where it should be the next morning, and the car was there. The shuttle had done its job. Everything was ordinary and fine, and we drove home. We don't talk about it, Steph and I, except one time, years later, after a couple of drinks, she asked me the only question either of us has ever asked out loud about that trip. It was the same question I had been refusing to ask myself the entire time we were on the water, and the entire time since. If the path along the far bank went exactly as far as we had come, and not 1 foot farther, then it had started the same morning we put in, on a bank we never set foot on until the very end, level with the bow of our canoe. I teach kayaking and I lead paddling trips for a living. I have spent more of my waking hours on the water than off it for the last 10 years, I'd guess, if you added it all up. I know water. I know how it sounds, how it moves, what a paddle blade does to it, and what the wind does to it, and how to tell those two apart with my eyes shut. It's my profession, listening to water. I'm telling you that up front, because the thing that happened to me in the Boundary Waters in Minnesota was, at the bottom of it, a water sound. And there is no one alive who is better set up to tell you that a water sound is wrong than somebody who listens to water for a living and has for years. I was up there on a longer expedition, a route that strings together a chain of lakes with portages between them, and I was doing some of it solo, the stretches between where I was meeting up with a group I was guiding later in the trip. It was on one of those solo days, a long flat water crossing of a big lake, the surface dead calm, like glass, and the very single dip of your own blade is the only sound for miles in any direction, and then a paddle stroke behind me. Not a wave, not the wind, not my own echo, a paddle stroke, the dip of a blade, the pull through the water, the little swirl and drip as it lifts clear at the end. The exact sound I make 1,000 times an hour, every working day of my life. One stroke, and then another, coming from behind me and a little off to one side. The completely ordinary, unmistakable sound of another kayaker coming up the lake behind me. I looked back immediately. The lake was empty and flat as a sheet of glass, my own wake spreading out behind me in a long, widening V, and nothing else on the water anywhere, in any direction, all the way to the far shore. No boat, no paddler, no wake but mine. My first reaction was thinking it was an echo of my own stroke coming back off the far shoreline, which is a real thing on very still water. The sound carries out and bounces and comes back, and I have heard it before, so I kept paddling. And the strokes kept on behind me, and every time I stopped paddling to listen, they stopped too, a beat after I did, and every single time I turned my head to look, the water behind me was glass, and there was nothing on it at all. This went on every calm stretch. Every time the water went truly still and I was alone on it, the strokes would come up behind me, and I tried everything a person who knows paddling knows how to try. I changed my cadence deliberately, fast, and then slow, and then fast again, and the strokes behind me changed to match, always a beat behind, like an echo that had a mind. I stopped dead in the middle of a big open bay, and lifted my paddle clear up out of the water, held it across the cockpit, and sat in complete silence, not making a sound. And into that silence came the strokes, 3 of them, dip and pull and drip, coming up behind me from out of the stillness, and then stopping, the way a paddler stops when they've drifted up alongside someone and mean to sit a while. And I never saw one thing. Flat, calm water, my own reflection looking back up at me, and a sound that followed me across every quiet lake in that whole chain. By the end of that day, I met up with my group. I guided the rest of the route, and on the busy water, with other boats around and people talking and paddles going everywhere, I never heard it once. Only on the solo stretches, only when I was alone, on calm water. And by the end, I had half-talked myself back into the echo explanation, just so that I could keep functioning, keep guiding, keep being the calm, competent one in the front of the group. I took out at the access point on the last day, helped the others load their boats onto the trailer, and I had very nearly let the whole thing go, filed it away under being tired, spooked and alone too long. And then, the outfitter, loading my kayak up onto the trailer, found it. My boat is a sit-on-top, a sealed hull design, the kind that physically cannot take on water because there's no inside for water to get into. It's a solid sealed shell of plastic with scupper holes molded through the cockpit that drain any water right back out. He went to swing it up onto the rack when he grunted and nearly dropped it. "What in the world have you got in?" Then he tipped the bow up, and water poured out of it. A hull I had been sitting on top of, paddling, riding high and dry for 2 solid days. We got it drained and turned it over, popped the little inspection port to look inside the sealed chamber, because he could not for the life of him figure how it had gotten flooded. And inside the sealed hull, where there should have been nothing in the whole world but dry air and the foam flotation, there was water, and there was silt. Dark, soft silt, lake bottom muck, the kind of cold black sediment that's only found way down in the deep parts of those lakes, 30, 40 feet down, where the sun never reaches and the water stays cold all summer. And settled into the silt at the very bottom of the sealed inside of my boat, there was a shell. A freshwater mussel shell, one of the big kind that only lives down deep, down on the cold, dark bottom where I had never been and where my boat, riding the surface the entire trip, had certainly never been. I have thought about it every single way a person who knows water can think about a thing. There is no way for the deep, cold bottom of those lakes, the silt, the muck and the mussel from 40 feet down, to get inside a sealed plastic hull that rode the surface the whole way. There is no mechanism. There's no crack, no opening, no way in or out. There is no way for any of it to be there at all, except for the one way, the way I will not be able to stop knowing for the rest of my life, that the whole time something was coming up behind me on the calm water, dipping its blade in time with mine, drifting up to sit with me in the silence whenever I stopped. It was also down there, down in the cold, dark bottom muck the entire time, riding along with my boat, and that when it was done following me, it left a little of the deep behind, packed into the bottom of my hull for me to find. I've been a land surveyor in Western Oregon for going on 16 years, but there's one line I cut in the Coast Range that fall is the only line I've ever followed that I wish to God I'd left alone. I was running a property boundary on a big private timber parcel, and the access was bad enough that I was dispersed camping the week off the back of my truck, rather than drive 2 hours of washboard logging road to a motel and 2 hours back every day. It was the 3rd day in. I'd hiked a couple miles off the truck to chase down a section corner, dropping into an old clear cut that had grown back up to head-high brush and replant when I cut the trail. A line of footprints came across the soft-turned ground of the cut, bare human feet crossing the soft dirt, adult-sized, maybe one size bigger than mine. That by itself was strange enough to stop me. Barefoot a couple miles into reprod with blackberry that'll open your shins through denim. But it wasn't what got under my skin. What got under my skin was the second mark. Beside every single footprint, a hand's width off to the right of it, there was a long, shallow trough dragged in the dirt, running parallel to the line of travel. Like whoever it was had been walking along on 2 feet and dragging something heavy beside them the entire way, something with weight, something that left a continuous groove. My first read was a poacher. Somebody'd killed something out of season and was dragging it out to a vehicle. That's the ordinary explanation, and I reached for it. But it fell apart fast. There was no blood, not a drop, and you cannot drag a fresh-killed animal any distance without blood and without flattening and tearing the brush you haul it over. And the brush here wasn't dragged through. The trough was too narrow and too even for a carcass that'd snag and bind. My second read was an injury, a man dragging a hurt leg, but the footprints killed that. 2 clean, even prints, a normal stride, no limp in the spacing anywhere along the line. There was no honest explanation in me that fit what I was looking at, so I did what I always do with a line I can't read. I followed it to learn what made it. It ran maybe a 1/4 mile through the cut, dead straight. That was wrong too. Now that I think back, nothing walks dead straight through terrain. You go around the deadfall and the wet spots, but this line didn't. It went over a downed log instead of around, straight through a blackberry tangle that should have shredded bare feet to the bone, holding its bearing like it was sighted on something. I photographed it as I went, the way I'd document anything unusual on a job. The prints, the trough beside them, the toe of my own boot set next to one of them for scale. The light was starting to go long and gold, and I told myself I'd follow it to its end, get my answer, and hike back to the truck before dark. It ended at an old campsite. You could read what it had been: a collapsed ring of fire-blackened stones, gone mossy. A rectangle of ground compacted hard and grown over with a different, lower moss, tent-sized. 2 rusted-through cans, half buried in the duff. Years abandoned, maybe decades. The kind of forgotten, dispersed camp you find way back in country nobody has any reason to be in anymore. The line of footprints and their drag mark ran right up to it and stopped, and I stood there in the failing light with a feeling like I'd done the arithmetic wrong somewhere, because the line didn't resolve. Why would a set of barefoot tracks dragging a heavy load just terminate here, at a dead campsite in the middle of nothing? And then I understood what I was actually looking at, and the order of it is the whole thing, so let me lay it out the way it came to me. I'd been reading the line as leading away from the campsite. I'd cut it out in the cut, followed it back here to this old fire ring, and called the camp its destination, the place it was headed. But a print tells you which way the walker faced, and these prints didn't point at the camp. The heel strikes and the toe digs all pointed away from it, out into the cut, out toward the deep timber I'd come down out of. I'd been walking the line backwards the entire time without realizing it. Whoever made these tracks had started here, at this dead campsite, and walked out into the wilderness, dragging that load along beside them, into the trees. The drag marks didn't end at the campsite. They began there. I sat in the truck that night and went back through every photo, zooming in until the screen pixelated whatever that person had been dragging beside them through the brush. They were not hauling it out of the wilderness toward a road and a vehicle and the rest of the world. They were dragging it in. And then, the way you do when it's 2 in the morning and you're alone in a truck 9 miles from pavement, I made it worse. That fire ring was old. The compacted tent ground was old, grown over, decades dead. Nobody had camped there in a very long time. But the prints out in the cut were fresh, days old at most, crisp-edged, mine the only other human tracks anywhere near them, which meant the camp and the walk were not from the same time at all. Somebody had set out from that long dead site, years and years after the last person could possibly have lived in it, and walked off into the deep timber dragging something heavy, and they had done it within the last few days. And when I went back through the photos of the ground right around the fire ring, I could see it under the fresh prints, faint, half-erased, packed into the harder soil, older grooves, old drag marks. The same paired trough, the same straight departing line, laid down and laid down again over what must have been a very long time. setting out from that same spot, walking the same bearing into the same trees, dragging the same kind of load, over and over, for years. I finished that boundary from the truck-accessible side of the parcel, and I subcontracted the back half to a guy I knew and ate the cost. I still survey. I still read ground. It's what I'm good at. But there's one thing I do now that I never did before. On every single line of prints I cut, before I note the species or the age or anything else, the very first thing I check is which way they're facing, and I have never once told a client why. I've guided fishing in Alaska for almost 20 years, bush operations, flying clients into remote rivers and keeping them alive long enough to catch the fish of their lives. The keeping them alive part is the actual job. The fish are the easy part. The fish are everywhere. The country is what kills people up here. The weather that turns in 20 minutes. The water that's colder and stronger than any of them believe. The bears. And most of all, the simple distance from any help at all. I've gotten good at the job, and in almost 20 years, I have never lost a client. One time, I came very close, closer than I've ever told most people. And the reason I didn't lose them is the thing I have never been able to explain to anyone, including myself. I had 4 clients out on a river, a good float plane flight from anywhere, a multi-day float trip down through wild country, no road within 100 miles of the water. On the 3rd day, the weather turned the way it can up there, fast, a heavy cold fog rolling in off the mountains and down the valley until you couldn't see the far bank of the river, couldn't see the bow of your own raft from the stern. And right when it closed in, we had to make a crossing, a braided section, where the river splits into a dozen shallow channels across a wide gravel flat, and you have to get out and wade the rafts across the fords between the bars. In clear weather, it's nothing, a thing I've done 1,000 times. But in that fog, with the water up from 2 days of rain, it went bad fast. We got separated in the murk. My clients ended up stranded out on a gravel bar in the middle of the braids with the channels rising around them in the rain, and me on the wrong side of a deep channel. No visibility, my voice not carrying 10 feet in that fog, the water coming up by the minute. And I will tell you plainly, as a man who has done this work 2 decades, that was a situation where people drown. I could not see them. I could not get a line to them. The water was rising and the fog was total, and I was, for the first time in my whole career, genuinely out of moves. And then there was a man with them. I couldn't see, well, nobody could see well, but I could make out shapes, and there was a 5th shape out on that gravel bar with my 4 clients. And a voice, calm and low, carrying clear to me through that fog in a way that no voice should have been able to carry, telling them where to step. I heard him more than I saw him, talking my 4 people through it. Here, put your foot here, now this rock, give me your hand, wait, hold, now. And I watched those 4 shapes come down off that gravel bar and across the rising channel to my side, guided every single step of the way by a man who moved through that water in that whiteout fog like he could see clean through it to the bottom, like he'd waded that exact ford 10,000 times in the dark. He brought them right across to me, and I had my hands full, grabbing my clients, hauling them up the bank, counting heads, breathing for what felt like the first time in 10 minutes. And when I finally turned to thank him, to ask who in God's name he even was and where he'd come from, there was no one. Just the fog and the river and my 4 clients, and no 5th man anywhere on that gravel flat. My clients thought he was one of my crew. They were rattled and grateful, and they naturally assumed the calm man who'd walked them across the rising water was somebody I'd sent, part of the operation. And I didn't correct them, not out there. I didn't have an answer that was going to help anyone in that moment. So I got us all off the river and got us home. Everyone was safe, and that should have been the whole story, a near miss and a stranger's kindness in bad weather. But it ate at me, the 5th man. Where he came from, where he went, how a stranger came to be standing on a gravel bar in the middle of a remote braided river, that you can only reach by raft or float plane, in a total fog. At the exact moment 4 people were about to drown. So when we got back, I asked around. I described him to the old-timers, the other guides who'd worked that country for decades, the bush pilots who've been flying that drainage 40 years. What little I'd seen of him, the way he talked, the way he moved through that water, the things he said. And one of the old guides got quiet, set down his coffee, and then he told me about a man who'd guided that same river back in the 70s and into the 80s. A legend on it, the old guide said. A man who knew that river better than anyone before him or since, who could read those braids in that ford in any water, high or low, day or night, and how that man had drowned, right there, at that exact crossing, in high water and fog, going back out into the channel one more time to bring in a client who'd gotten stranded on a gravel bar. He got the client to shore. He didn't make it back himself. They searched and they never recovered him. The river kept him, somewhere down in that ford he knew better than the lines on his own hands. The man the old guide described, down to the calm and the way he'd talk a frightened person across bad water one step at a time, was the man who walked my 4 clients off that bar in the fog. Nobody else was on that river. There was no flight in or out but mine, no other party within 100 miles, no way on this earth for a living man to have been standing in the middle of that ford in that fog. But somebody was. Somebody who knew that crossing better than anyone alive ever has or will. Somebody who'd lost his own life doing the exact thing he did for me, going out into the high water and the fog to bring the stranded in off the bar. He's still working that ford. He's still bringing people across. And I've taken clients down that river plenty of times since, and every single time we come to that crossing, I go quiet and I say a thank you out loud, to the water, to the fog, to whoever's still down there minding the ford. My clients think I'm praying. And I suppose, in a way, I am. If these stories from the people who know the backcountry better than anyone made you rethink that next trip past the tree line, smash that like button, hit subscribe so you never miss the next nightmare, and tell me the moment that creeped you out the most. And if you think the scariest part of being stranded is being alone, stuck out there with no way home and no one coming, oh man, you're about to find out it's the exact opposite. So stay tuned for the next one, coming soon. 10 scary stranded horror stories. Because the second the engine dies and the trail runs out, you learn it real fast. Being stranded was never the nightmare. Finding out you were never alone out there, that's the nightmare. Thanks for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next nightmare. Man, it feels good to be back.